So today we're going to dive into the Quran's longest chapter, Surah Al Baqarah. And to really get what makes it so profound, you have to kind of step back in time. You have to picture this brand new community at a massive turning point in history, facing incredible challenges, not just from the outside, but from within, too.
Here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll tackle the name itself and what it means. Then we'll look at the new era it was revealed in. After that, we'll explore its message to the people of the book, see how it acted as a blueprint for a whole society, and finally, look at the new kinds of trials the early Muslims were facing.
All right, let's start with a name, because let's be honest, it's something a lot of people wonder about. You have this incredibly detailed chapter laying out the foundations of faith and law, and it's called Al Baqarah, the cow. So what's the story behind that? And you know what? That is a great question. The answer actually tells us something really fundamental and maybe a little surprising about how the Quran is structured. Okay, so this is where we need to kind of rewire how we think about chapter names in the Quran. They aren't meant to be titles that summarize everything inside, mainly because the topics in a single surah can be so incredibly vast. Instead, a name like Al-Baqarah is more like a unique marker, or an alama in Arabic. That word means a sign or a way to distinguish something. It's basically just saying, this is the surah where that story about the cow is mentioned. It's a signpost, not a summary. Now, moving on. To really feel the weight of Surah Al Baqarah, we absolutely have to talk about the Hijrah. You know, that historic migration of the Prophet Muhammad and his followers from Mecca to Medina. This wasn't just about changing cities. It completely changed the game. The entire context and purpose of the Islamic mission transformed overnight. And you can see that shift so clearly here. Over on the left, you've got the Makkah period. The focus there was all about teaching the absolute core beliefs, mostly to an audience of Arab polytheists. But then, boom, they get to Medina, and the landscape is totally different. The main audience now includes the people of the book, the Jewish tribes who were already there. And the mission itself got way bigger. It wasn't just about preaching anymore. It was about actually building a functioning society and state. And that leads us right into one of the most critical themes in this entire surah, that direct conversation with the people of the book. See, in Medina, for the very first time, the early Muslims were living alongside established communities who already had this deep shared history with the idea of one God, with revelation, and with the prophets. So the way the Quran sees it, these communities were, at their core, followers of Islam, if you take Islam to mean its universal principle, which is submission to God. The idea was that over many, many centuries, their beliefs and practices had slowly drifted away from the original, pure teachings brought by their own prophet, Moses. So the really important thing to get is how the surah talks about this deviation. You can see a few of the key areas right here. For instance, mixing foreign elements. That points to cultural ideas that were seen as watering down pure monotheism. Altering scriptures was a major point, whether it was changing the text itself or just twisting its meaning to fit certain agendas. And then there's the loss of spirit, where faith becomes just a shell of rituals, without that deep inner connection. And maybe the biggest one of all, viewing faith not as a message for everyone, but as some kind of exclusive ethnic inheritance. So when you read the beginning of Al-Baqarah, you're seeing this powerful two-part message unfold. On one hand, it's a really detailed critique of where things went off track. But at the exact same time, it's a genuine invitation for the people of the book to come back to the pure original faith that their own prophets taught. Okay, so you have this deep conversation happening in the first part of the surah, but then it shifts gears completely to address something else that was incredibly urgent. Once the community was in Medina, they weren't just a scattered group anymore. They were forming a new state. And what does every state need? It needs a constitution. And that's exactly what the later parts of Al-Baqarah delivered. It was the blueprint for their entire social order. It laid out principles for everything. You have social guidance on things like marriage and divorce. You have economic rules, like the famous prohibition of interest or riba, and guidelines for business and charity. It set up a legal framework for justice. And it even provided the political structure for how the community would govern and defend itself. This was the foundation of an entire civilization, being revealed step by step, right when they needed it most. But, building a new society from scratch, it's never easy. The community in Medina was immediately hit with intense pressure from two very different directions. There was a clear external threat, but also a new, sneakier threat that was starting to pop up from within. And this really lays out the two sides of the coin. On one hand, you've got the external challenge. This tiny city-state was now on its own, facing opposition from basically all of Arabia.
Survival itself was going to take incredible patience and courage. But that internal challenge, the rise of the Munafiqeen, or the hypocrites, that was arguably even more dangerous because it threatened to rot the community's trust and unity from the inside out. And what's fascinating is that the surah gives us this really early, sharp analysis of this new problem, even breaking down the different motivations. You had the saboteurs, people who might have claimed to be Muslim but were really trying to cause trouble. Then you had the opportunists, the classic fence-sitters, just trying to get the benefits without any real belief. The waivers were a bit different, maybe less malicious, but they were still torn between their old tribal ties and their new faith. And finally, the uncommitted, the ones who kind of got it intellectually but just weren't willing to make the sacrifices that this new life required. So when you pull it all together, Surah Al Baqarah is so much more than just a random collection of verses. It's this incredible, comprehensive guide that came down for a community at a pivotal moment in history. It's a callback to pure faith, it's a legal foundation, and it's a timeless lesson in how to persevere against all odds. So that leaves us with a big question, right? We've seen how the surah acted as a practical, divinely inspired blueprint for building a just and resilient community from the ground up. The real challenge for us, living in our own complicated and difficult times, is to ask, how can we take its powerful lessons about community, justice, and spiritual strength and actually apply them today?